Agreed to. I give the call to the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Before the election, you couldn't move for seeing the Prime Minister in a fluoro vest and a hard hat, glad-handing apprentices and workers, and he said, and I quote, "An incoming coalition government will help more young Australians to start a trade, stay in a trade and finish a trade." But what is becoming increasingly clear is that these were hollow words. Without telling people, we have seen the axe taken to the Tools for Trade program and halving the funding which is paid for apprentices' tools, cutting the scheme from $1 billion to $476 million over 4 years and replacing it with this program that we are debating in this bill today. And I want to share an email from a fourth-year apprentice called Matthew, who said, and I quote, "The changes affect me and 2 other apprentices in my depot, along with thousands of other apprentices nationwide who rely on these payments. While I do not agree with the changes to apprentice funding, I am disgusted that they can change the system apprentices such as myself are halfway through." Another fourth-year apprentice, also called Matthew, said, and I quote, "The current Abbott government is going to rip this up without any thought of how it will affect us. Every bit of money helps, especially as I'm also supporting my wife and daughter and paying a mortgage. The removal of this payment is approximately 6% of my annual income, and I could only imagine the uproar if Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey were asked to delete 6% of their annual income." And this is what another apprentice called Luke said. He said, "I am grateful that I was the beneficiary of the Tools for Trade program throughout my apprenticeship. I used the money to buy tools like big-ticket items such as drills that cost upward of $700. Apprentices already struggle with a low income, studying and paying bills. These incentives are what attract young job seekers in the first place, without the added stress of paying loans like a tertiary student." End quote. And that is from Luke. And Luke speaks on behalf of thousands of other apprentices around this country who have opted to go and do an apprenticeship and to work on the low wages that entails while you're being trained up. And they've done it on the basis that they are not going to be plunged into debt. But instead, that's exactly what this government intends to do. For someone who ends up as a carpenter with a starting salary of $40,000, you can estimate that it will take them, if they take out the full whack of the debt, 34 years to pay that off. It'll be less time for someone who is in a higher paid occupation, automotive engineer, welder, plumber or electrician. But what is clear is that we are moving towards putting all of the young people in this country, whether they're at university, whether they're doing an apprenticeship, or whether they have the misfortune of being out of work and looking for a job, further into debt and making it harder for them to get by. Now, the minister and this government comes in and says, well, it's justified to rip up the grants program and to put people further into debt, making one of the most offensive statements that has probably been uttered with respect to apprentices, saying it's okay because they were spending the money on, quote, tattoos and mag wheels for their cars and birthday parties. Well, firstly, there's no evidence of that. Not one shred of evidence has been put forward, and it is disgraceful that a government minister will use their position supposedly to speak out on behalf of apprentices, being the responsible minister, instead to slur them all without any evidence. But if that were even the government's motivation, and it's not, because the government's only motivation is to cut spending on apprenticeships and put apprentices further into debt, but if that was the government's motivation, you'd expect there'd be some restriction in this bill on what students and apprentices who are now going into debt could spend the money on. But no, there's not. For all the government cares, they can spend $20,000 on another set of mag wheels and tattoos as long as they're in debt, instead of being given a grant. And the fact that this government has not thought through how this loan scheme is going to work, the fact that there are no even suggested restrictions on it so that it has to be linked to tools, shows that that offensive suggestion about tattoos and mag wheels was nothing more than a distraction and an offensive slur on all apprentices so the government can get away with its agenda. And its agenda is to cut funding to young people and instead put them further into debt. This government is not getting rid of debt. You hear a lot of talk from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer saying the government was elected to tackle debt and deficit. Well, I'll tell you what they're doing. Not getting rid of debt, they're just shifting it away from the government that can bear it onto apprentices, students and young people who can't. Now, the government also suggests that one of the reasons that they want to introduce this scheme is to address the low level of completion rates amongst apprenticeships. Now, it is admirable to want to look at why so many apprentices aren't completing their apprenticeships. And it's admirable to say, let's perhaps give some incentives, as this bill purports to do. However, what this government has failed to take into account is that the biggest reason most apprentices don't finish their training is because they're let go by their employer. It's because they're let go by their employer. It's not because they don't want to finish, it's because their employer lets them go. Now, what does this new move from the government do to those people who are a year or two away from completing their training but are then let go from their employer? Well, those people, for no fault of their own, are now going to end up with a debt and without any training to perhaps get themselves into a job to repay that debt. So people who are in that category that we know exists, it's the single biggest reason apprentices don't complete their apprenticeship, it's because they let go. Those people are now going to find themselves objectively worse off thanks to this government. They are going to find themselves not only without an apprenticeship, not only without a road to get a good job, but they're going to find themselves in debt as well. And then, while they're looking for a job, they're going to have to spend 6 months of every year without any New Start. That's what this government has in store for people under 30. And that's why this is another one of the bills that's part of the government's measures that will brutalise Gen Y and everyone who comes after them and make life incredibly difficult for anyone under 30 in this country. And part of the government's agenda, of which this bill is a part, is to make it so that for everyone under 30 in this country, you will be forced to accept any old job with any old wages and any old conditions. And it doesn't matter that through no fault of your own your employer sacked you and you didn't finish your apprenticeship. If you don't want to live 6 months of the year with no income at all, you better go and take that job paying less than the minimum wage. And you don't want to complain about that, because if you complain, then you'll find yourself put through the washing machine again and having to spend another 6 months without any income. That's the vision that this government has for this country. Now, when we know that the most common reason for people not completing their apprenticeships being employment related, and we combine that with the fact that apprenticeship commencements are also declining, we have two choices. You can do what the government's doing, or you could do the sensible thing, which is to put more money into apprentice training to boost commencements and completion rates. We just know that a loan scheme is likely to deter students from low-income and disadvantaged backgrounds. It stands to reason. And the government has been unable to confirm in the Senate estimates process or anywhere in this debate that they won't change the arrangements for this debt in the future, similar to what they've done with HECS debts. So, for all we know, the debts that these apprentices are about to incur, they could ask them in the future to pay them back even more quickly, or at even higher rates of interest. And if you look at what they've done to higher education students, you'd imagine that that is only a year or two away. If we really wanted to build a sustainable and a clean economy, we would be investing in our apprentices. We wouldn't be saddling them with thousands of dollars of debt. By funding apprentice training and investing in infrastructure, we could build the skills of the future to help Australia get ahead of the curve. And rather than relying only on the private sector to train the next generation of Australian workers, the government should take a leading role in funding and support so that we have a generation of workers skilled up and ready to build a clean economy. And the idea of owing Tony Abbott's government thousands of dollars in debt will just send a chill down the spine of many young people thinking of starting an apprenticeship. And as we've seen with the massive changes to the HECS system, it doesn't matter if you've signed up for a lower interest rate, this government is going to slug you anyway. And so it is crystal clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, that what this is about is not a better deal for apprentices. This is about making life worse for many, many apprentices. This is about making life grim for young people and gutting the supports that would see apprentices commence apprenticeships in greater number and complete them in greater number. It is no wonder that there have been many, many submissions on behalf of apprentices and on behalf of working people saying debt is the wrong way to go, and I urge the government to reconsider this measure, to reinstate the tools for trade programs and to treat our apprentices with respect instead of disdain.
I thank the member for Melbourne.